There's a decision in your life right now that feels heavier than it should. On paper, it's simple. Stay or leave. Say yes or say no. Continue or change direction. And yet, every time you try to decide, your mind loops. You make lists. You analyze scenarios. You imagine outcomes. You wait for clarity. But clarity doesn't come. Instead, there's tension, a tightness in your chest when you think about choosing, a subtle anxiety when someone asks what you're going to do, a strange paralysis that makes you delay the conversation again. You call it overthinking. You call it indecision. You tell yourself you just need more time. But what if the problem is not confusion? What if the problem is identity? Most difficult decisions are not about options. They are about who you become once you choose. Carl Jung understood that the ego forms around identity structures, roles, stories, self-images. These structures give you continuity. They tell you who you are. And when a major decision threatens one of those structures, the ego resists, not because the choice is unclear, but because the identity attached to the current path feels safe. Let's make this real. Imagine you build a career over 10 years. You've invested time, reputation, relationships. People know you as this role. Your family is proud of this role. You introduce yourself with this title for years. But recently, something feels off. You feel drained, disconnected, uninspired. You imagine leaving. And immediately anxiety floods in. What would I even be? What would people think? What if I regret it? Notice something. Those fears are not about the job itself. They are about losing the version of yourself that the job represents. If you leave, you are no longer the reliable one, no longer the successful one, no longer the stable one. You are undefined, and undefined feels dangerous. Humans prefer painful certainty over uncertain freedom, so you stay in analysis. You tell yourself you're being responsible, but underneath, there is grief. Grief for an identity you may have to release. This applies to relationships too. You may know deep down that something is misaligned, but leaving would mean you are no longer the partner, the caretaker, the chosen one. And those identities can be more addictive than the relationship itself. So instead of deciding, you stall. You tell yourself you're confused, but often you are not confused. You are attached to the continuity of self. Jung spoke about the tension between the ego and the self. The ego wants stability, predictability, recognition. The self, the deeper organizing center, pushes toward growth and wholeness. When the self demands evolution, the ego experiences it as threat. That threat feels like anxiety. You might notice, you feel calm when you imagine staying, but something inside feels small. You feel anxious when you imagine leaving, but something inside feels expanded. That expansion is frightening, because expansion means unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar territory does not come with guarantees. Let's look at something simple. You are deciding whether to move to a new city. You imagine staying. Your body relaxes slightly. You know the streets, the people, the rhythm. Then you imagine leaving. Your heart beats faster. You feel fear. But beneath the fear, there is curiosity. That mixture, fear and curiosity, is often growth trying to emerge. But the ego labels fear as danger. And so you retreat. Indecision becomes a safe middle ground. If you don't choose, you don't lose. But if you don't lose, you don't evolve. There's another hidden layer. Sometimes indecision protects you from disappointing others. Maybe your parents expect you to stay in a certain field. Maybe your social circle expects you to maintain a certain lifestyle. Choosing differently would challenge their perception of you, and that feels destabilizing. So instead of confronting that discomfort, you tell yourself you need more clarity. But clarity is not always intellectual. Sometimes clarity is emotional. You already know which direction feels more alive. You just don't want to grieve the version of yourself that will disappear. Because identity death feels dramatic. It feels like losing status, losing belonging, losing familiarity. But here is something important. You have already changed. The discomfort you feel is evidence. If the old identities still fit, you would not feel tension. The tension exists because something inside you has evolved beyond the structure you are maintaining. And maintenance is exhausting. You might notice subtle signs. You talk about your future less confidently. You avoid certain conversations. You feel irritated when asked about plans. Those are not signs of confusion. They are signs of internal misalignment. But misalignment is easier to tolerate than identity death. So you hover in between staying and leaving, in between old and new, and that in-between state feels safe but stagnant. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Becoming requires choosing, and choosing requires losing. You cannot keep every version of yourself. You cannot preserve every identity. At some point, growth demands selection, and selection demands sacrifice. That is why indecision feels heavy, because you are not just choosing an option. You are choosing which self survives. That is not a small thing. So if you are stuck right now, stop calling yourself weak. Stop labeling yourself indecisive. Instead, ask a different question. Which identity am I afraid to let go of? Is it the responsible one? The admired one? The safe one? The loyal one? When you identify the identity, the paralysis becomes clearer. You are not afraid of the future. You are afraid of losing continuity. But continuity is not always growth. Sometimes it is comfort, and comfort can become a cage. The first step is not making a decision. It is admitting what you are protecting. Because once you see what you are protecting, you can ask yourself something more honest. Does this identity still reflect who I am, or only who I was? That question changes everything. The most uncomfortable part of making a big decision is not the risk, it's the disappearance. When you imagine choosing differently, you don't just see a new future. You feel the collapse of familiar self. And the ego does not surrender easily. Carl Jung described the ego as the center of consciousness, the part of you that says, "This is who I am." It organizes your experiences into a coherent identity. It protects continuity. So when a decision threatens that continuity, the ego interprets it as danger, not metaphorical danger, psychological danger. This is why your body reacts before your logic does. You might notice your heart races when you imagine leaving. Your stomach tightens when you picture changing direction. Your mind floods with worst-case scenarios. That physical reaction is not necessarily intuition telling you don't do it. It may be your ego reacting to identity instability. Let's slow this down. Imagine you've always been dependable one. You stay. You commit. You endure. Now you're considering walking away from something that no longer fits. If you leave, you're no longer the dependable one. You're the one who quit. Even if the situation is unhealthy. Even if staying is shrinking you. The ego whispers, "What if this proves you're inconsistent? What if this means you failed?" Notice how the fear is not about the situation. It's about the label. Identity is built from accumulated labels. The achiever, the loyal one, the stable one, the strong one. These labels feel like stability, but they can become cages. Because once you attach your worth to a label, you will defend it, even at the cost of your growth. Indecision often appears when two identities collide. For example, you see yourself as ambitious, but you are drawn to a quieter life. You see yourself as independent, but you want deeper intimacy. You see yourself as rational, but your heart is pulling you towards something uncertain. Instead of admitting the identity shift, you freeze. Because choosing one identity feels like betraying another, and betrayal of identity feels like self-destruction. But here is something Jung understood deeply. The self, the deeper totality of who you are, is larger than the ego's current identity. The ego says, "This is me." The self says, "There is more." When the self pushes for expansion, the ego feels threatened, and that threat feels like anxiety. You may experience this as constant rumination. You replay the decision over and over. You imagine both futures repeatedly. But no matter how much you think, you don't move. Because thinking is safer than choosing. Thinking preserves identity. Choosing risks altering it. Let's ground this in something concrete. You're in a relationship that feels stable but stagnant. You are respected. There is no major drama. But you feel emotionally distant. If you leave, you risk being labeled ungrateful. You risk losing the identity of being the committed one. So instead of leaving or staying consciously, you remain in limbo. You detach emotionally but stay physically. You complain privately but avoid decision. That in-between state protects identity, but it slowly erodes integrity. Because deep down you know something has shifted. Integrity requires alignment between inner truth and outer action. When they diverge, tension builds. That tension often shows up as irritability, fatigue, low-level anxiety, resentment without clear cause. It's not the decision that's exhausting. It's the delay. Because delay requires you to live in contradiction. Carl Jung believed that neurosis often emerges from prolonged inner conflict. When the ego refuses to adapt to new psychological realities, symptoms arise. Overthinking can become a symptom of resistance, not intellectual complexity. Resistance. You might say, I just need to be 100% sure. But no identity transition comes with 100% certainty, because certainty belongs to the known self. Growth belongs to the emerging self. The emerging self cannot promise familiarity, and that is why it feels unstable. Here is something important to notice. When you imagine staying, you feel smaller, but safer. When you imagine leaving, you feel anxious, but expanded. That expansion is not comfort. It is possibility. Possibility requires letting go of definition, and the ego prefers definition over possibility. Definition gives you a script. Possibility requires authorship. Authorship is intimidating, because once you choose differently, you cannot blame circumstances. You become responsible for your path, and responsibility is heavy. Sometimes indecision hides a deeper fear. If I choose differently and fail, I lose the excuse. As long as you stay, you can say, this isn't really me. I could have done something else. But once you choose, you commit. And commitment removes fantasy. Fantasy protects ego. Reality refines it. There's also grief in this process. Not grief for the option you lose. Grief for the version of you that existed inside that option. If you leave a career, you grieve the years invested. If you leave a relationship, you grieve the identity of being someone's partner. If you move cities, you grieve the familiarity. Grief does not mean the choice is wrong. It means something mattered. But something can matter and still be complete. Jung once wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Becoming requires shedding. Shedding requires discomfort. And discomfort often disguises itself as indecision. Instead of asking, what if I make the wrong choice? Try asking, who am I afraid of no longer being? That question brings clarity. Because often, the resistance is not about the future. It's about identity preservation. And identity preservation can quietly sabotage evolution. If you are stuck right now, try something simple. Imagine you woke up tomorrow and the decision was already made for you. No blame, no judgment, just done. Notice your immediate emotional reaction. Relief? Panic? Sadness mixed with lightness? That reaction is information. Your body often knows before your ego allows it. You are not indecisive because you lack intelligence. You are indecisive because you are standing at the edge of identity transformation. And identity transformation is one of the most destabilizing experiences a human can have. But destabilizing does not mean destructive. It means restructuring. The ego fears disappearance, but the self seeks wholeness. The question is not whether the fear will vanish. It won't. The question is whether you are willing to tolerate temporary instability for long-term authenticity, because eventually, avoiding the decision becomes more painful than making it, and that is when movement begins. At some point, the question shifts. It's no longer, what should I do? It becomes, how long am I willing to stay divided? Because that's what indecision really is. Division. One part of you already knows something has changed. Another part of you is trying to preserve what feels safe, and living between those two parts is exhausting. You wake up thinking about it. You fall asleep thinking about it. You feel irritation in conversations that touch the subject. It's not the decision itself draining you. It's the split. Carl Jung spoke about the tension of opposites, how psychological growth requires holding opposing forces until a new integration emerges. Right now, you are holding two forces: the self you've been, the self you are becoming. And the longer you refuse to choose, the longer you prolong the internal conflict. But here is something important. You will never feel completely ready to let an identity go. There is no clean emotional signal that says, now it's safe. There is usually fear. There is usually grief. There is usually doubt. Waiting for fear to disappear before choosing is like waiting for the ocean to become still before you learn to swim. Fear is part of identity transition. The goal is not to eliminate fear. The goal is to tolerate it long enough to act from alignment instead of preservation. Let's bring this into real life. Imagine you decide to leave a job that no longer fits. The week before you resign, your mind will likely produce arguments to stay. It's not that bad. Maybe I'm overreacting. What if the next thing is worse? This is not clarity. It's the ego bargaining. The ego tries to minimize discomfort to avoid restructuring. But notice something. When you imagine staying long-term, not just another week, what happens in your body? Do you feel expansion or contraction? That contraction is not weakness. It is misalignment. Alignment does not always feel euphoric. Sometimes it simply feels like relief, a quieter nervous system, a reduction in internal argument. If you imagine choosing a new direction and feel fear mixed with relief, that mixture matters. Relief often signals authenticity. Fear signals unfamiliarity. Unfamiliarity is not the same as danger. Another important shift in this stage is understanding that identity is flexible. You are not locked into one version of yourself forever. You may fear that if you leave, you are abandoning the responsible version of yourself. But responsibility can evolve. You may fear that if you choose something unconventional, you are losing credibility. But credibility built on suppression is fragile. You are not erasing your past. You are integrating it into a new form. Jung believed that individuation involves integrating past identities rather than destroying them. The disciplined version of you can exist inside a new career. The loyal version of you can exist outside a misaligned relationship. The strong version of you can exist in vulnerability. Growth does not require annihilation. It requires adaptation. When you choose differently, you are not betraying who you were. You are updating who you are. And updates feel destabilizing because they disrupt continuity. But continuity without evolution becomes stagnation. Here is something practical you can do. Instead of asking, is this the perfect decision? Ask, which choice feels more honest? Honesty may not feel safer, but it feels cleaner. There is less internal argument, less self-justification, less hidden resentment. If you choose from fear of losing identity, you will likely feel temporary relief, followed by deeper dissatisfaction. If you choose from alignment, you may feel temporary anxiety, followed by deeper coherence. Coherence is underrated. Coherence means your inner truth and outer behavior match. That match reduces psychological friction, even if the path is uncertain. You do not need to broadcast your transformation. You do not need to defend your choice to everyone. Sometimes the most mature decisions are quiet. You simply begin acting differently. You stop explaining why you're staying in something that drains you. You stop overanalyzing. You move, and movement creates clarity. Clarity rarely comes before action. It often comes after commitment. Think about times in your life when you finally made a decision you had postponed. Once it was done, even if the outcome was uncertain, the mental noise decreased because the internal division ended. Energy that was previously used for rumination becomes available for adaptation. Adaptation builds confidence. Confidence is not certainty. It is self-trust. Self-trust develops when you see yourself survive your own decisions, even imperfect ones. If you remain stuck forever, you never gather evidence that you can handle change. You only gather evidence that you can endure stagnation. Endurance is not the same as growth. If you're standing at a crossroads right now, understand this. There is no version of the future that preserves every identity you've ever had. Something will be left behind. But that is not tragedy. That is development. The child identity gave way to the adolescent. The adolescent gave way to the adult. You did not lose yourself. You expanded. This stage is no different. You are not indecisive. You are grieving the identity that carried you this far. And grief deserves acknowledgement. So before you choose, allow yourself to say, this version of me mattered. Then ask, does it still reflect who I am now? If the answer is no, the next step is not intellectual certainty. It is courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is movement despite it. The ego may feel like it is disappearing, but what is actually disappearing is limitation. And on the other side of limitation is a self that feels less performed and more real. Choosing will not make you fearless. It will make you aligned. And alignment, over time, is worth more than preservation. If a decision in your life feels impossibly heavy, it may not be because you lack clarity. It may be because you are standing at the edge of identity change. Carl Jung understood that growth requires shedding outdated identifications. The ego resists this process because identity feels like safety. It gives you continuity. It tells you who you are. But when who you are becoming no longer fits who you have been, tension appears. That tension feels like indecision. In reality, it is grief. Grief for the reliable version of you, the admired version, the safe version. Something in you has already evolved. That is why the decision feels charged. If nothing had shifted internally, there would be no conflict. You are not stuck because you are incapable. You are stuck because choosing means letting go. And letting go means becoming undefined for a while. But undefined is not broken. It is transitional. You do not need perfect certainty. You do not need fear to disappear. You only need enough honesty to admit which choice feels aligned, even if it feels unfamiliar. Identity will always change. That is not failure. That is development. You are not indecisive. You are negotiating who you are ready to become. And once you accept that something must be released, movement becomes possible. Alignment may feel unstable at first, but over time, it feels lighter than preservation ever did.